So let's talk about global illumination, or I will refer to it as a GI from now on. Here I have a scene with bonbons and a simple ball, and I have some sort of a stage element, so I can have some background and geometry, so I can have shadows. We have a standard 242 material, and this scene is calibrated by the eye. I showed how you would calibrate your scenes. I just filtered those lights out because they really clutter the scene. And here you can see correspondingly in Object Manager, you can see this is the top light, and these numbers are actually the brightness values of each light. Also, I have set this show in a reflection guy, so I can have nice speculars once we will deal with this, and we will actually shade and render this scene completely, so we'll see the process later. And area shape is set to rectangle, and I have a contrast of 50%. I also showed you why I use this 50%. Along with that, all lights have this physically accurate fall-off, so they will behave really realistically and naturally, because I really want this scene to be but somewhat realistic. Okay, so I want to have really nice dispersions of light and really nice shadows and fall-offs. And only this right light, which is the brightest in intensity, has an area shadow which is currently set only to be let's say in a draft mode, so something like 10%, and this minimum and maximum samples guy adjusted accordingly. So prior to actually enabling global illumination, let me just, in most simplest terms, because I really thought how could I explain GA system, which is really technical and really complicated. It has so many intertwined values that are dependent on each other. How can I really present that to someone who really does not want to think about all the technical stuff, because I really don't want to cram you with the technicalities and geeky stuff. I really want to present it in a much more simple way. Also, I forgot I have this shadow really quickly accessible here in the head-ups display. Okay, so I showed you how to do even this, so I can quickly disable shadows if I want to, just to get some render speed. Along all that, I really want to tell you something before. I will explain many settings in GI. Let me just firstly enable it here as the effect. So effects, global illumination. Let me just close that for a second. I will explain many settings, but it's almost completely impossible for me to show on examples or to really dissect every single settings in GI. That would be really time consuming. That would probably be a tutorial for itself. It would last at least 10 hours really to get a really decent grasp on global illumination. Also, when I will be talking about some settings, I may use an explanation that will be really much easier for you to understand, but it would not be probably technically correct. So let me just draw a simple comparison. Let me just tell you what I mean by that. For example, when you ask someone how much does he weigh, he will answer you in I don't know, in pounds or kilograms, and that is really understandable to you. But in fact, the weight is expressed in newtons. That is an accurate measurement for the weight. And the pounds and kilograms or stuff like that is actually to measure mass. So it may be for the ones that you are really technically good and you really do understand those settings, it may feel that I'm doing something wrong, I'm telling something wrong. But in fact, I just want to simplify those settings, really to put them down to earth so a casual, regular Joe can understand them. Okay? So just to cut it short, in general, when you do a standard render in Cinema 4D, you are somewhat limited, because when light hits the object, it will not bounce from it. It will not bounce from, for example, this bonbon to second bonbon, pick up some information, then bounce and bounce a zillion times again, really to create really natural and realistic results. And that is exactly what global illumination is. So when a light hits the surface, it will collect some information. For example, it will collect a bit of color from that surface and it will bounce, for example, to this ball. So whenever a light hits here, it will blossom in many directions. And every single of that rays from that blossom will hit another surface and blossom again in a flowery fashion. Okay? So you can really imagine how much computational power that needs. And GI is really demanding on hardware. And the other way to look at GI is, let's imagine that you have a really quick option to put, let's say, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 lights and to really organize them in the scene in really some random or exactly placed manner. So you can get really nice results and achieve realistic illumination. So let's open this render settings guy, and here we have global illumination. We added it earlier, so in case you don't have it here, just add it here as an effect. Okay, currently it's not here because we already have it. The first and the most easiest GI mode, which we will explain, is this QMC mode. Okay? And I choose this for the start because it has really a small amount of settings. So let's start with this general mode. And this QMC actually stands for Quasi Monte Carlo, and you can find on the internet why it's called that way, but let me just briefly explain what that GI mode does. The light will travel and it will hit a surface, and in this mode every single pixel in scene will send additional rays. Okay? It will send additional light in other directions, in all other directions, proportion, like in a flower. I hope you get what I mean. And every single of those that is sent in every other direction will hit another surface and do exactly the same thing. You can see already that this option can produce the most quality results. Okay? But it needs high sample count to do so, and the dark side of the things is enormous render times. And the problem, if this sample count is low, your scene will be rendered grainy, and you don't want that. Maybe you just want that if you are going for some artistic result, but in most of the time you would really want your scene to be nice and clean without graininess. So this default sample count is 64. It's not really good. I suggest as a starting point, I suggest at least 256 samples. Okay, so samples until, let's say, 4,000 or even 5,000 can be rendered on really good machines in somewhat decent time, but anything beyond that, so from 5,000 to 10,000, it will really bog down your machine and renders will go in days. And that is not really suitable in a production environment. And the benefit of this method is it really produces magnificent results. It uses brute force to render every single pixel with additional light information, and it can look really good and realistic. Okay? This is the closest thing in Cine 4D to an unbiased render engine. Okay? So let's get back to general, because I want to discuss these settings. And this diffuse depth guy, well, just to avoid misconceptions, this means how many times that light will bounce. Will it bounce once when it hits the surface? And If you set 2 here, it will bounce again when it hits another surface. So if it hits a surface for third time and the diffuse depth here is 3, it will bounce once again. So this is a number of bounces. Okay? So you can limit this and say, for example, 2 or 3 is really enough for the most of the scenes, and anything greater than 4 is really unnecessary in my opinion. The next guy here is this primary intensity guy. And this means that the primary intensity of the light, the one that is set here under the general settings of your light, will be used. And this secondary intensity is currently disabled, and this is because we have only one bounce. So there is no secondary bounce. And that secondary intensity, it won't be available until you have secondary bounce. You see that? Now you can actually set that. And that secondary intensity will have 100% brightness value now. And you can increase or decrease that value any way you want. So for example, the light, when it bounces once more, can be maybe too bright or maybe too dim. You can really set that. And this primary intensity, that is like an overall brightness intensity slider. And as you can see, those settings are a bit technical. And unfortunately, there is no way around it. Here under current selected QMC mode, we have many more options like that will be available for these other options. Here under QMC, let's talk about this oversampling guy. And this can be really quite confusing. When you will have lights or polygon lights or polygon portals we will talk about in your scene, sometimes their size will be too small and this general sample count won't be enough to sample that light exactly. It will produce errors, it will produce artifacts, and maybe the shadows won't be correct. That's why you have this oversampling value for the complete scene, or you can really set this. Let me show you in material per material basis, but only materials that have this active luminance channel. Okay, the materials that cast light can be oversampled here under illumination channel. So you can currently see the sampling mode is normal, and every of this setting can really increase or decrease your render speed and quality, because there is no setting that works most of the time. Okay, maybe this oversampling guy is always desirable. Okay, it will, in 99% of the cases, it will cut down the render time and give better results. The downside of these guys is, these three guys other than normal, is they really don't work well with caustics. And we will talk about caustics. Okay. Hope I haven't lost anyone yet, because there is really a lot more to come, and I really can't think of a way to explain this more simply, because simply it is not simple. It cannot be. It's really technical and complicated, but there are some presets that you can use without worrying about everything that will work in almost any situation. So you can really avoid this technical geeky stuff. Here under details we have a debugging information level. Here you can actually create a text file that you can read some information about your current global illumination, and this is really geeky, and you can actually completely forget about this setting. This next guy is a glass mirror optimization. Well, that will basically mean if you have a material that is currently set to 80%, if you have a material that is 80% or more reflective, or transparent material that is 80% or more reflective, the GI system will completely ignore it. Okay? And the reason why it will ignore it, because it will cut down render time and you will not be able to see the difference. Here we have a refractive caustics that will say it's enough for you to render refractive caustics, and we have reflective caustics. this guy, this reflective caustics, is really computationally intensive. I mean really, really intensive. And the effect is barely visible. Okay? So do not enable this if you're not absolutely sure what you are doing. This next guy, diffuse illumination only, well, if you enable this, Cine 4D will disable all textures, and it will disable reflection, so you will be actually able to see the GI illumination itself in the scene. Okay? So it's really useful. This height prepass is currently checked off because we are in this QMC mode. So let's once again, as simply as we can, explain these settings. This QMC means that when light hits the surface, it will blossom like in some sort of a flower in every direction from every single pixel to another surface. This amount of times. Okay? So you can limit those bounces with this depth. So 2 means 2 bounces, which is also not technically correct, but to give you a really good understanding. And any value that is higher than 3 or 4 is really not usable, at least to my opinion. This primary intensity of the light that is coming, and the secondary intensity is related only after the first bounce is made. Okay, this gamma, you should look up gamma on the internet, and here under QMC we have a sample count. Higher sample count means higher quality. Okay. Oversampling is oversampling per scene basis. This ratio guy, you should really forget about this ratio guy. It's really you will not be using that much. You have presets here, and anything higher than medium is really an overkill. So I suggest stick to weak always. And also, as you showed, if you have a luminant material, then you can do an oversampling based on that material exclusively. Okay? And along that, you can play with this compositing tag here. Let's see now for the compositing tag, just to make further adjustments for oversampling on a specific material. Here under details, it's really simple to understand. So this is for geeks, this first. This is in optimization. If something is greater in transparency or reflection that you set here, it will be ignored. This means render refractive caustics. This means do not render reflective caustics. This means basically means render everything without textures and reflections and everything that bothers me, so I can really see the light distribution and dispersion of my global illumination. And this height prepass is not active since we are not in other modes. And the other mode that I want to cover here is the ER, which stands for irradiance cache, and that is our next guy which we will cover. Once again, I strongly suggest, I know this is boring, I know this is technical, I can understand that this can be a little overwhelming, but this is crucial for you to understand some of these settings, because there is no way I can explain the whole GI system in every single setting. That would make your head spin. But for your sake, and for the sake of getting better and understanding how actually things work, and how you'll be able to optimize your scenes and do really nice renders, bear with me and just hold on as this GI session finish. After we finish GI, we will render a few scenes so you can really see the power of global illumination at work. Okay, so let's explain our next guy, which is this irradiance cache guy. I want to talk about another method of global illumination, and this one can really be, let me just delete it so we will actually add it with default setting. This one is called irradiance cache, and it's different compared to QMC mode. And Let me tell you how it's different. When you have QMC mode, you can put really high amount of sample count, and that will give you really nice renders. However, that has a disadvantage in really render hit. It will take enormous time to render certain scenes, even days, and that is completely unacceptable. That's where the irradiance cache method jumps in. So firstly, let me discuss about this standard irradiance cache method, which is still image, and we can find some common settings. So diffuse depth means exactly the same as we discussed in QMC. It basically means how many times the light will bounce when it hits another object. Okay, so let's go with 2. Also, the values over 3 or 4 are really somewhat unnecessary unless you are exactly know what you are doing, and you will put higher numbers here. As you increase this diffuse depth, you're adding to render time significantly, especially in this irradiance cache mode, in this still image mode. This primary intensity, of course, is the intensity of the primary light, and the secondary intensity is the intensity of the lights that are bounced after the first bounce. So let's now open this irradiance cache tab, and please don't be scared by this. We will cover some of them really. I will maybe skip some that are really not so relevant, but just to push you in the right direction what these settings mean. And prior to that, I really have to disable a few things in the scene just to have really fast renders. Okay, so let me just here under anti-aliasing, I will completely turn it off, and I will drop that guy here in the my viewport. I will just right click on it and tell it to show always, regardless of what I choose. It's just a matter of having it really accessible and available right here without going into render settings and stuff like that. So I want to completely disable anti-aliasing because it will decrease the render time. And also I want to completely disable the shadows. So let's now cover this irradiance cache guy. The first is called stochastic samples, and it has a fancy name, but actually this samples is we can consider it as a number of detail, okay? Something like that. So here under this drop down menu I can actually set that Cinema4D will calculate automatically based on your scene low, medium or high amount of those samples. Okay, so you don't actually have to know what is the sample count you have to use. Here you have a custom accuracy. Let me go from high, and you can see it's 90% accuracy. If I go down it's 75%, and if you go for low it's 50% accuracy. The custom accuracy simply lets you enter a number you want here. The only other option here is a custom sample count, and we will cover this as soon as I show you something here. So I'll put first this to low and this record density to preview, just to have as quick as possible results in the render. Let me see at my output how big is that image. Okay, this could be acceptable, and let's do our first GI test render. So let's hit Shift and R, and the picture viewer will light up, and you will see some strange things happening. And you can see that it lights up the scene differently. You can see it's much brighter. You saw some sort of splotches and stuff, and I really want to show you what those splotches and dots mean. So I will just here under Global Illumination, I will set here under Details, under Irradiance Cache. Well, I will set this to pre-pass only, so Cinema4D won't render this final image. It will just render that dots and stuff that we're calculating, so we can actually see what this is. So let's try again. Let's hit Shift R once again. And this is what we have. And you see these guys? These guys are samples. Okay? If you go to render settings, here in the preferences, you can actually find out the number of samples. And here under renderer, you have to enable this show global illumination info in console. So now if you go to window console or press shift plus F10, you can actually see now that you can read the number of samples. This is really useful if you want to enter here under stochastic samples that exact number. So what do these guys actually mean? Well, those guys are exactly the same as in QMC, but in QMC method there will be one guy for every single pixel in your scene, and that is really high amount of those guys, and that will calculate really slowly. Here in this irradiance cache guy, you can actually set a lower amount of samples, and those guys are called records. You can even set the density of those records and actually play with many values here. I will cover some so you don't get lost. And once you have amount of samples are satisfied with, then you can set the density of those records. And what is important now, Synapse4D will interpolate everything in between those guys. Okay, so it will interpolate the brightness values and it will interpolate the shadows, so it doesn't have to do it for every single pixel. That will really significantly speed up renders. Let's now change. There are preset values that can help you here. For example, if we set this to low and low, it will work rather nice. So Maxon really included those low, medium and high values. Don't think low is low quality. It is most certainly not, as you will see. So let's try with low and low. So we will see what happens. Yeah, we'll see actually that we have more of these guys. The scene will be much more defined. Just scale it. And you can see here, let me just delete this guy and show you the difference here. Render time for this first prepass is 4 seconds. And as soon as I increased this from preview to low, I got 1 second more in render. Let's see what happens if I add a medium here. And medium also here. So if you have medium here, you will most certainly need settings around medium here. So let's try with that and see what happens. There you can see many more of these guys. It will be the calculations of the lights and shadows. It will be much more precise. And actually, see, it really now takes a much longer time to calculate those guys. You can see here the unbelievable difference. 31 seconds as opposed to 5 or 4. That's a considerable render hit time. And we'll just change those two guys from low to medium. I think you really now get this stochastic sample setting. So it is either low, medium or high, and it will automatically calculate it regardless of the scene. Or you will use custom accuracy here, or you will enter your own sample count. And these low, medium and high values are really dependable on what is your scene scale, number of lights, number of objects in the scene. So it will dynamically calculate those values. I suggest always go with the low value first. So let's go to our record density guy. This record density determines the minimum and maximum rate of those records. So it will use maximum rate where is needed and the minimum rate where is needed. It's some sort of like in AA settings. It will use this if it can. If it can represent this with -3, it will use it, and if it can't, it will use maximum value. So let me explain what this -3 and 0 actually means. This 0 means that every single pixel where is needed will be sampled. Okay? That's the maximum rate. So if we have 800 pixels by 600 pixels image, you can imagine the number of these final pixels for this maximum rate. And if this is set to -1, it will say use it for every other pixel. Okay? But this is not really technically correct, but it will give you a good understanding. And this basically means use the half resolution of your image. If you lower it even more, it will mean use a quarter of resolution for a minimum rate. If you go even lower, it means use even lower resolution. If you, for example, enter 0 here, you will say C4D, use 1 by 1 pixel, use all pixel resolution. Do not cut the information to half or a quarter or something like that. And when you use same values in minimum and maximum rate, you will use a fixed value. So you can, for example, use -2 by -2. So you will say, I want a quarter resolution of these records in my image. Okay? I really hope that you are able to follow. This can really confuse most of the people, but please bear with me. This is really important. So you will optimize your render times and get really nice renders, because this is crucial. These two guys, these settings under stochastic samples and record density are absolutely crucial for good GI renders. So I suggest leaving this to low also. So let's go with low. And you can see what the numbers are set. So when this record density is set to low, the maximum rate would be, you see it's -1. The maximum rate of the records will be half the resolution that you have in the image. You can even go in positive values, and that would mean double the resolution for each pixel, which can really be an overkill. So 0 would practically be the best. So if you enter 0 and 0, you will get probably the best results, and everything in positive values like 1 and 1 and 5 and 5 would be definitely an overkill. So 0 and 0 are the best, and lowering them down means less quality, less records. This radius, minimum radius, and density control, I really want to skip them because they're kind of technical, and I don't think you would benefit actually from getting them right now. I want to give you information, just enough information so you can understand them later once you absorb these main values. Maybe just this radius value. This is simple, so I will really cover it. This really controls the amount of these samples in corners and crevices. And when you have a connection, for example, like a corner, it will define the amount of records in the corner. So if you set this to 0, then number of information in corners will be really packed with those samples. And if you set this to 100, then you will not get that extra records in the corners. And you want extra information in the corners because simply that will give you much more precise results. But I really suggest you don't fiddle with these settings. Here is the interpolation method. Let me just collapse these two guys so it doesn't come in the way. This interpolation method, I suggest leaving this always at least squares. This is the type of interpolation between these guys, okay? These dots, these sampled records. This smoothing defines how smooth transitions and these spaces in between those guys are calculated. I suggest leaving this to medium. And if you lose resolution, or if your shadows become really bad or are not so dense and they don't have some sort of a nice quality, I suggest lowering this to weak first. But you have to know all these settings work together. So if you lower this to weak or even to minimal, you will probably have to increase both samples and both record density. Otherwise, you will get artifacts and blotches and stuff like that. GI system is really powerful, but it can be a little bit difficult to grasp at the start. The next guy is oversampling guy, and it's really for those like sort of a general setting for oversampling, which really doesn't mean much to you, but you can leave it at weak. It doesn't mean bad, or it won't give bad results. Okay? So it's one of those settings you won't fiddle around until you wrap your head around GI system a bit more. This also works for distance map and check record visibility. We will skip that, and this guy is very special. And it's called Details Enhancement. If I open it, let me just tell you something. If your renders lose details and you're using some sort of a lower values here, I suggest activating this guy, and you will get much more definition in small areas. It will enhance the detail. For example, if you lose details in small crevices or in displacement or stuff like that, activate this. I suggest leaving this activated at all time. It will take some render time. It will be a little slower, but it really pays off because this detail enhancement is designed to use QMC where it needs. It's also not really quite technically correct, but I'm really trying to put it down to earth terms so you can comprehend this a little bit more. Okay, so the next step is irradiance cache file. Let's say you put it some values here, and render took really long time. This prepass, this calculation of GI took some time. The advantage of it, it saves that information. You can reuse it. That's the cache. So imagine that you calculate it for an hour or 2 or even 3 hours. This GI prepass, this lighting information. So you can imagine redoing it all over again. That is why this autosave option is enabled all the time. And you can see there is 25,308 records and the amount of disk space that gets. And you can load that exactly the same cache, exactly the same information. So Cine4D will skip calculating. And if some things change, and you can actually see in a help system what settings, you can change many settings here. And it will not calculate all over again. It will just add additional information into that cache if it needs to. That is superb feature in Global Illumination. This lock guy. Let's say you have done your GI and you're really satisfied with it. You can completely lock it. So you will tell Cine4D, do not change anything in my cache. And once you calculate this global illumination, you can play with these AA settings as much as you want. It won't calculate that again. This is really good. Here you can set a custom location, and those files are called, they have a GI extension. And finally we have a details tab, which is exactly the same as in QMC, and we discussed it, so I won't discuss it again. Let's get back here under General. Here under GI mode, you will find some additional modes, and here you can see there is an irradiance cache camera animation. And here you can find irradiance cache plus QMC, still image, camera animation, full animation, net render, and that is really self-explanatory when to use each of this setting. So if you're going to, we will explain now this QMC. It's a little bit different than irradiance cache method itself. So If you're rendering still images, select this one. If you only camera is animated in your scene, then you would use this one. If your camera and the scene objects are animated, you use this. And if you're a really lucky guy and you have a super mega cluster of computers, you can render it over the network. Okay? We will also discuss briefly just this sky sampler guy. Let's change the method to irradiance cache plus QMC. If we scroll here around these settings, you will see absolutely no settings are different. It's completely exactly the same. Just the GI mode is a little bit different. The most simplest difference between those two guys is this plus QMC method. After the light hits the object for the first time, it will not generate a new flower of lights in all directions for that secondary bounce or even for the third bounce. It will just create a single one. And as opposed to this irradiance cache, it will generate a flower of rays and samples for every surface that it encounters, no matter of this number of bounces. Okay, so it's more expensive. It's really computationally expensive, but it produces better results, especially in interior scenes. So if you're going to render interior scenes where you have to have lots of information where the light is in enclosed space, you want to go for this irradiance cache method. This irradiance cache and QMC method really doesn't suffer from the render time increase if you increase this diffuse depth number. So you can go really, really, really high with this. And this is sort of a brightness values. It means how many bounces and how bright your scene overall will be. This is really useful if you want to save render time and for rendering exteriors and situations where you don't have to have so many precise additional rays, additional flowers of samples. Okay? So the only thing that is left is this sky sampler guy. And this guy is really simple. It doesn't have diffuse depth, so it means it has only one bounce, and it will sample HDRI image really good. So if you have an outdoor scene and you want to light it with the HDRI image, you would rather choose this sky sampler guy, and you can set here the number of samples. So as you increase them, the quality will increase, and everything else here is completely the same. So that's it for the GI, and actually we will now use this scene and we will shade it and render it just to see how it comes to life, and I will show you the actual workflow.